When you walk down the baking aisle of your grocery store, flour seems like the most straightforward ingredient on the planet. It's flour, grain ground into powder. Nothing could possibly be simpler or more basic. Yet what you're actually grabbing from that shelf tells a much more complicated and troubling story about how American food manufacturing handles something as foundational and essential as what goes into your bread, your pancakes, your cakes, your cookies, and your children's lunches every single day. Most shoppers never stop to ask why some flour costs half as much as other flour, or what actually happens to grain between the field and the bag, or why certain major brands quietly change their sourcing while keeping the same label design and marketing messages year after year. The flour category has become a masterclass in obscured choices and hidden compromises, and the patterns are consistent enough, repeated enough, across enough major brands that understanding them fundamentally transforms how you shop. Not just for flour, but for understanding what real transparency actually means in food production, what hidden compromises look like when you know where to look, and how the most basic staple ingredients hide their stories in plain sight behind clean packaging and familiar branding. This matters because flour is not a specialty item or a luxury product. It's a staple. It's something that exists in your kitchen right now, probably in multiple places. And the way the industry treats flour, the way they obscure information about flour, tells you something profound about how they treat everything else you buy. Let's start with the first major pattern that defines a massive portion of the entire American flour market: the bleaching and bromination standard that most conventional mills use without adequately calling it what it really is or what it means. Bleached all-purpose flour is absolutely everywhere in American supermarkets. King Arthur, Gold Medal, Pillsbury, every store brand, Kroger, Safeway, Whole Foods, they all use bleached flour because it's cheaper to chemically bleach grain than to let it naturally age for weeks, and because bleaching creates a uniform, bright white color that American consumers have been trained and conditioned to expect through decades of marketing and visual association. The bleaching agent itself is typically chlorine gas or benzoyl peroxide. These are powerful oxidizing agents that chemically alter the flour's color and protein structure at the molecular level, making it behave differently in baking than unbleached flour would. The vast majority of conventional mills incorporate this as standard operating procedure. It's not illegal. It's not undisclosed in the ingredients list. The bag says bleached flour right there on the front in clear print. The fundamental problem is that most shoppers see that word and think nothing of it at all, because bleaching feels like a purely cosmetic choice, something done only for appearance, like whitening toothpaste or hair dye. What's actually happening is a significant chemical transformation designed to make flour handling easier for massive industrial bakeries and to create that bright white flour that looks premium on the shelf and signals trust and quality through visual association alone. Now, here's where the pattern deepens into something considerably more consequential and concerning. Many major brands don't just stop at bleaching. They also add potassium bromate, or they used to until recently, and some still do, though they're increasingly reluctant to admit it. The FDA approved bromated flour decades ago because it strengthens dough, making industrial-scale baking faster and easier. It improves final bread volume. It makes profit margins cleaner. It reduces production time and equipment stress. But potassium bromate has been banned in the European Union, Canada, Australia, and Japan. It's been on the regulatory chopping block in the United States for years because bromated flour breaks down into bromate, a chemical classified as a possible human carcinogen by the International Agency for Research on Cancer. The FDA has never officially banned it, despite pressure and petitions, and as of right now, bromated flour is still entirely legal in the United States. But its use is declining in the American market, partly because major brands face mounting consumer pressure when they're discovered using it, partly because the risk profile got harder to defend publicly, and partly because companies discovered they could market around it. What actually matters for your shopping trip is this critical fact: many mid-tier and budget-tier conventional brands still use bromated flour. The label says enriched bleached flour or enriched flour, or sometimes just wheat flour. It does not say bromated anywhere on the front. You have to read the extremely fine print or look at the supplier's website or contact the company to know if bromate is in there. This is the first major pattern that repeats consistently across the industry. This is transparency through omission. The ingredient is legal. The label is technically accurate according to FDA regulations. The FDA allows it, but what shoppers don't know is that they're choosing a product treated with a chemical that the entire rest of the developed world rejected as unacceptable for human consumption. Your neighbor in Canada cannot buy bromated flour because it's banned. Your cousin in Europe has no access to it. Your friend in Australia cannot find it. But you can buy it freely in your American supermarket without even knowing it's there, without even knowing to look for it. The second major pattern is more subtle in its execution, and it's about sourcing, opacity, and invisibility. Most American all-purpose flour comes from a blend of hard red winter wheat and hard red spring wheat. This is the standard across the industry. But where that wheat actually comes from, how it was grown, what pesticides and chemicals were used during production, how it was stored, and how it was handled between harvest and arrival at the mill is almost never transparent on the label or in marketing materials. A cheap Kroger all-purpose flour and a mid-range gold medal all-purpose flour may come from entirely different wheat sources with entirely different production standards and agricultural practices. One might be commodity wheat grown with heavy pesticide use in enormous industrial operations. The other might be sourced from a more controlled supply chain with different agricultural practices and environmental standards. You won't know by looking at the bag. The label doesn't tell you. The brand doesn't advertise it. The retailer certainly doesn't highlight it. This is pattern number 2. The entire wheat story, the foundation of the entire product, is completely invisible to the consumer. Consider that modern conventional wheat farming relies heavily on glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup, used as a desiccant right before harvest to speed up grain drying and allow for faster mechanical harvesting without weather delays. This practice is entirely legal. It's widespread across American agriculture. It's documented in residue testing year after year by independent researchers. But most commodity flour brands do not disclose their wheat sourcing, do not publish pesticide protocols, do not test for residue levels, and do not make this information readily available to consumers. You're buying flour made from grain that you have absolutely no visibility into. Again, this isn't necessarily criminal or immoral by current industrial standards. It's how industrial agriculture works at massive scale. It's how the system is built. It's how profit is maintained. But it's a profound transparency gap between what the packaging suggests, clean, simple, pure, trustworthy, natural, and what the supply chain actually involves from soil to harvest to storage to mill to your kitchen. The third major pattern is enrichment, opacity, and misunderstanding what the word enriched actually means, and how it's used to mislead. Most white flour sold in America is enriched. This means that during the industrial milling process, the bran and germ are removed, which strips away most of the natural vitamins, minerals, fiber, and nutritional density. Then synthetic vitamins and iron are added back in minimal quantities, meeting only the minimum federal requirement. The label says enriched flour. The average consumer thinks enriched means more nutritious, better for you, improved, enhanced. Enriched actually means we remove the nutrition and added back the minimum required by federal law to prevent severe deficiency diseases like beriberi. It's a legal definition, not a health claim or a mark of quality or improvement. But it works as a powerful trust signal anyway. Enriched feels good. It sounds positive. It sounds like an upgrade. The reality is that enriched flour is nutritionally much leaner than whole wheat flour, much less bioavailable and absorbable than whole grain, and represents a significant nutritional downgrade from the original intact grain. Many brands push enriched all-purpose flour as the default, standard, everyday choice without offering whole wheat as an equal shelf presence. Because enriched flour is cheaper to process, has better shelf stability for longer storage, and sells based on habit and convenience rather than nutritional value or transparency. This creates a fourth major pattern, whole wheat opacity and quality variance, across different brands and products. When brands do offer whole wheat flour, the quality and freshness can be wildly inconsistent, from brand to brand and batch to batch. Whole wheat flour goes rancid much faster than white flour because the intact germ contains oils that oxidize when exposed to light, heat, and oxygen over time. Many conventional brands mill their whole wheat flour months or even years before it actually reaches the consumer sitting on a store shelf under fluorescent lights. The label won't tell you when it was milled. The bag won't tell you how it's been stored or transported or how long it's been sitting in a warehouse. A year-old whole wheat flour may be oxidized, less nutritious than when it was fresh, and subtly off-tasting compared to recently milled whole wheat flour. But the label looks identical to fresh whole wheat flour. The packaging design is the same, the branding is the same, you have no way to know the difference. Pattern number 4. Whole wheat is treated as an optional add-on rather than a core product, and its freshness and quality are completely hidden from the buyer. The fifth major pattern is about specialty and artisanal positioning, and how premium branding obscures continued participation in the default industrial system. Brands like King Arthur now market themselves as premium, heritage-focused, quality-obsessed, small batch, carefully considered, and in many ways, they legitimately are different from commodity brands. They do things differently than most competitors, but they also still use bleached flour in their mainstream products. They also still participate in the same enriched flour as default logic as cheaper brands like Gold Medal and Pillsbury. The difference is transparency and sourcing clarity. King Arthur publishes their sourcing information online. They've moved away from bromated flour. They offer more whole grain options prominently. But they still sell bleached, enriched all-purpose flour as their core, flagship product. The premium positioning and heritage branding allow them to charge substantially more while relying on many of the same basic industrial system components as everyone else. Consumers buy King Arthur thinking they're making the smarter choice, and in some ways they are. But the choice is still fundamentally shaped by what the industry decided is normal, acceptable, and profitable. The sixth major pattern is store brands and private label complete invisibility and unaccountability. Kroger, Walmart, Target, Amazon Fresh, and every other major retailer has a store brand flour. These are often produced by larger mills under contract and repackaged under the retail brand without even naming the actual producer or mill. The sourcing is even more obscure. The transparency is even lower. You're buying flour from a source that the retailer hasn't even named, that you have no way to research independently, that has no public accountability. The price is lower, which is attractive when you're shopping on a tight budget. But the trade-off is complete supply chain anonymity. You're trusting a store brand based only on price, on the assumption that your supermarket wouldn't sell something dangerous or illegal, and on the fact that your supermarket carries it. That's not necessarily wrong reasoning, but it's the deepest version of the transparency problem in the entire flour market. You've outsourced your due diligence entirely to a corporation's profit motive. Now here's the critical pivot, the moment where understanding these patterns actually transforms your shopping trip and your relationship to this staple ingredient. Understanding these patterns doesn't mean you need to panic or spend double on flour or completely change your baking habits overnight. It means you need a shopping framework that actually works, that you can apply in the aisle without needing a degree in food chemistry, that doesn't require hours of research before you buy something as basic as flour. It means you need to know what to look for and why it matters and what the actual alternatives are. There are three distinct brands and brand categories that genuinely break away from these patterns by building the opposite approach, by choosing transparency over obscurity, and by backing up their marketing claims with actual verifiable practices. The first is Bob's Red Mill. They publish detailed sourcing information on their website and on their packaging. They mill fresh whole grains and offer multiple grain options, not just all-purpose flour. They do not use potassium bromate in any of their products anywhere. Their all-purpose flour is unbleached, which means it hasn't been chemically treated to whiteness. Their whole wheat flour is clearly labeled with guidance on freshness or approximate milling dates, so you know what you're actually getting. They cost more than commodity flour, but you're paying for transparency, and that transparency is backed up by their actual practices and their willingness to put that information in your hands. Bob's Red Mill doesn't market themselves as saving the world or as a miracle solution. They market themselves as honest about what they do and where it comes from, and they actually are, consistently and verifiably. The second is King Arthur Baking Company. Despite being part of a larger corporation now, they've maintained and even strengthened a commitment to sourcing transparency that goes significantly beyond the industry standard. They publish a supplier list online. They've eliminated bromated flour from their entire product line. They offer both bleached and unbleached options so you can choose based on your values. They mill in-house, which gives them control over the entire process. Their bags include information about their sourcing philosophy and their grain partners. They're transparent about the trade-offs in their choices. Again, cost is higher than commodity flour, but the transparency is real, documented, and verifiable if you want to verify it. The third category is smaller, regional brands that focus on freshly milled, locally sourced flour from known grain partners and local farmers. These vary significantly by region and availability, depending on where you live. But brands like some community-supported mills that partner directly with local farms represent a completely different model from industrial flour production. You know where the wheat comes from, you often know the farmer. You know when it was milled because it was likely milled recently. You're often directly supporting regional agriculture and smaller-scale farming. The trade-off is limited availability depending on where you live. Sometimes less consistency across batches because there's no industrial standardization, and sometimes higher cost because there's no economy of scale. But the transparency is absolute. You're not guessing. You're not relying on a corporation to tell you the truth. You're buying from a source you can actually investigate and verify. What ties these three categories together is that they operate from visibility, not from obscurity. They assume that if you know what they're doing, you'll respect the choice or you won't, but either way you deserve to know. They don't rely on vague claims or clever packaging design. They don't hide anything. They don't depend on consumers not asking questions. That's the actual standard that matters. That's what real transparency looks like when it's actually implemented. So if you're standing in the flour aisle right now and you grab a bag of conventional Gold Medal or Pillsbury or a Kroger store brand, you're not doing anything wrong, and you're not a bad person or a bad parent or a bad shopper. But you should know what you're actually buying. You're buying enriched, bleached flour that may contain potassium bromate depending on the specific brand. You're buying grain from sources that aren't transparent. You're buying flour that nutritionally is a blank canvas filled back in with the minimum legal requirement. You're buying based on price and habit and the trust that the label and packaging design create, which is largely built on you not knowing the full story, on the industry banking on your passivity, on the system that benefits from your not asking difficult questions. If you want to change that calculation, the move isn't expensive or extreme or difficult. It's informed. Buy unbleached flour. This alone removes the bleaching agents and often signals a brand that's more careful about the full process. Look for brands that publish sourcing information. Read whether potassium bromate is listed in the fine print. Check if there's a milling date if it's available. Buy whole wheat flour more often, understanding that freshness matters and that rancid whole wheat tastes noticeably wrong. except that flour without artificial bleaching will look slightly more cream-colored rather than bright white. That's not a flaw or a defect. That's actually what flour looks like before industrial processing adds the artificial whiteness. The deeper truth here is that the flour category works the way it does because most shoppers never ask questions or investigate. They grab the same bag they always buy without thinking about it. The label looks clean and trustworthy. The price is reasonable and familiar. The system, from the mill to the distribution center to the retailer, depends entirely on that passivity and on consumers not investigating further. The patterns repeat because there's no visible pressure to change them from below. But the moment you shift to unbleached, to sourced, to transparent, you're stepping out of the default industrial model that the majority follows without thinking. And you'll notice that flour tastes slightly different, performs slightly differently in your recipes, and feels like a choice you actually made rather than one that was made for you by generations of marketing and manufacturing habit and what the industry decided was normal and acceptable. Your next trip to the grocery store, spend 10 seconds in the flour aisle. Look at the bag. Is it bleached or unbleached? Can you find the sourcing information? Is potassium bromate listed? Is it enriched or whole grain? Are there milling dates? Those questions alone change what you're buying and what you're supporting. That's not paranoia or overthinking. That's just paying attention. That's being a consumer who knows what's actually in your cart and what went into making it. And once you start asking, the flour aisle becomes a lot less simple and a lot more honest, and you understand not just flour, but how the entire food system depends on your choice between knowing and not knowing, between asking questions and accepting defaults.